The UDRcast is not affiliated and does not represent any 12-step fellowship. I, Bill Ward, the host of the UDRcast, will be sharing my experience and my journey of recovery. That does include, but is not limited to, the literature contained in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 Steps. Our guests will be sharing their own path to recovery and what has worked for them. The UDRcast encourages and supports all paths to recovery. Welcome everybody to the UDRcast. UDR stands for Uncover, Discover, and Recover. My name is Bill Ward, and I'm coming to you from the recovery capital of Canada, Calgary, Alberta. Here we are going to discuss everything recovery, different perspectives, different experiences, both with the people I know and with others from around the world. If you resonate with anything you've heard on this episode today, we ask that you share it with anyone who you think may benefit from it. If you have any questions or comments, please find us at BILLWARDLIFE and send us a message in the info section. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. If you are interested in more recovery content, you can find the buttons for the YouTube channel and other social media outlets on the homepage, and you will be redirected to those platforms. We can recover, one person, one family, one community at a time. The UDRcast is not affiliated and does not represent any 12-step fellowship. I, Bill Ward, the host of the UDRcast, will be sharing my experience and my journey of recovery. That does include, but is not limited to, the literature contained in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 Steps. Our guests will be sharing their own path to recovery and what has worked for them. The UDRcast encourages and supports all paths to recovery. Welcome everybody to the UDRcast. UDR stands for Uncover, Discover, and Recover. My name is Bill Ward, and I'm coming to you from the recovery capital of Canada, Calgary, Alberta. Here we are going to discuss everything recovery, different perspectives, different experiences, both with the people I know and with others from around the world. If you resonate with anything you've heard on this episode today, we ask that you share it with anyone who you think may benefit from it. If you have any questions or comments, please find us at BILLWARD.life and send us a message in the info section. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. If you are interested in more recovery content, you can find the buttons for the YouTube channel and other social media outlets on the homepage, and you will be redirected to those platforms. We can recover, one person, one family, one community at a time. Okay, so Janine, you're here and you want to talk about grief. I guess you've seen in the rooms, as you've been around a little while now and you're interacting with many different types of people through your sponsorship and through fellowship and, your Facebook and all these different aspects of interaction with people, you're seeing a lot of people struggling and not knowing how to grieve. And so part of this conversation today is we want to be able to try to help people understand grieving and be able to grieve, correct?
Yeah, and not just to understand grief, but how to apply the 12 steps and our literature and how to support others within the rooms when they're going through grief and when they've experienced a loss.
Okay. To me, grieving is a process that is individual to everybody, and it takes a long time. And depending on where you're at within your smashing of your ego, if you're still really connected to your ego, then you're going to grieve and you're going to suffer a lot. But if you're working the 12 steps as per the practical application of what the steps do, then you will be able to navigate grief in a positive manner because you're you're disassembling the ego, which is actually what attaches mostly to the suffering part of the grieving process. So you were going to talk about some part of the science that, because your background is very scientific, and so we're going to try to help people understand in a way that, you know, uses science and spirituality, correct?
Yeah, I think there's a benefit to that because there's a lot of people who, you know, they really value the why in understanding. And I think often in understanding the why can help conceptualize where they are in that process. Just like how you would explain to somebody and how you've like explained to me along the way. One of the things that's been really beneficial is saying, okay, this is coming up because this is where you're at in recovery. And this is what's going to happen after step 5. You're going to have a step 6, 7 kind of drop off where these things happen. And then, you know, year 2, year 3, these things are happening. And just the knowing of where you are in that process helps a person to navigate that. So I think that that's where, you know, the science can be beneficial in understanding some of those things, just to give a person, you know, a placement in their process.
Okay, I getcha. So in a sense, so last year was year 6 for me. I went through a really dark time in April, May into June of last year. That ironically in my 6th year. And why I say ironically in my 6th year is because to me step 6 is a lot of pain and humiliation, and there's some fucking darkness as you're working through some of the shit that you're trying to relinquish. So in my 6th year, I had one of my toughest stretches in all of my recovery. And but the thing that I knew is I knew that what I was going through was part of the process. And there was a lot of grieving in there. And I was grieving, you know, I realized we had a meeting. It was a Fellowship of the Spirit meeting that we do on Zoom. And this woman that I had sponsored had just lost her father. And she was on the meeting and she was dealing with this, right? Or trying to deal with it. And, you know, this woman's really attached to her ego. And honestly, she suffers a lot. And a lot of it's self-imposed. But regardless, besides the point, she brought up the topic, grieving and loss in recovery. And a number of people shared on the topic. And then I got to share, maybe 5th person in. And then something hit me, but I was already going through some let's say shadow work. I was doing some work with my sponsor that was like deeper level stuff where I was trying to pull some of this up, but it hadn't actually been pulled up really. We were working through it, but really when we're working this, we can't always see what's happening in the subconscious, so I didn't actually see what was happening. And then when this woman brought up the topic and I started sharing, there was like, my mind went, holy fuck, you're gonna cry, and you're gonna cry big, and you got 20 people on the meeting. Are you gonna cry, or are you gonna say fuck it? And I almost said I'm not gonna share and passed, but then like all these split second thoughts in my brain were like, okay, well, you can validate others that they can also share and be vulnerable if you do that right now. And then I decided in the split second that I'm gonna share, and I fucking bawled my ass off. And I cried from the depths of my soul. And in these moments of these shares, I realized I had never grieved the loss of my family. I never grieved the loss of my relationship with my wife, Shannon. I had never grieved the loss of my business or the loss of anything. And we mostly think that grieving is only about people. But no, grieving also can be categorized into belief systems. They can be categorized into old behaviors. They can be categorized into many different things. And in this big share that I had, I realized I hadn't actually grieved much of anything. Which is why, you know, I talk a lot about in the program, like if you don't keep a clean house and you're able to deal with the shit when the shit comes up, the shit will deal with you. So as I went through this dark time, I felt like my skin was crawling and I couldn't fucking do anything. I'd lay in bed and I could see my skin crawling because I was so full of fucking anxiety and fear and all this shit. And I would drive out to the mountains and I would try to relieve myself because driving to the mountains normally fucking works for me. going for drives, doing certain things. Nothing was working for me. I basically stopped going to meetings. And I would go to the odd meeting, and I remember this woman who knows me really well. She looked at me and she said, "Are you okay? You don't look very good." And I'm like, "I'm not very good." And I usually am pretty good, but I wasn't good. And I remember through that period, you know, it was probably 2 or 3 months long, there was thoughts like of suicide. But the thing that kind of held me on, going back to your point about knowing what you're going through and me being able to predict like what you were going to go through as you were going through it. Okay, this is going to happen at here and this is going to happen and watch for this and blah, blah, blah. I knew what was happening. I just didn't know how long it was going to happen for. So even though I had thoughts of suicide and I couldn't shake this off of me, and no matter what I was doing, I couldn't get through it, I had to feel myself through it, and I had to let the energy run through me, and I had to just give it the time that it needed.
So when you were going through that, how did you know where you were at in that process? Like, did you have somebody talking to you about that, or did you learn that through the literature, or how did you know where you were and how to get out of that and how to navigate through it?
So me personally, and I don't even really want to talk about this because I don't want people going out and doing what I'm going to talk about, because I think it's very detrimental to the organic process of grieving and recovery. But I was 6 years sober at that time, and I was basically doing shadow work. So I was reading shadow work books and I was studying shadow work at the time.
Was this around the time that you did that step 4 just on shame?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I knew what kind of to expect. But I also read that like if people go into this shadow work and they're not prepared, they will fucking kill themselves. Right? So I don't want people going into shadow work. I don't want them looking up shadow work. I have sponsees that look it up and try it, and I'm like, drop that shit. Because really what you're doing when you start digging into the shadow when you're not ready is you're stirring up subconscious shit that doesn't need to be stirred up, because the process of the steps is organic and it will come up when you're ready for it. But because self is so wants what it wants, it starts digging around in toxic shit that it has no business digging around in, and then you will fucking pay for that because you're not ready for it yet.
So what was your motivation in doing that?
Well, I knew I was doing that deep set of steps with my sponsor, right? And I was doing it out of another 12-step piece of literature that when he started working with me, he's like, do not do this with anybody else because it's so deep. So that's what was happening with my sponsor, and I knew what we were doing. And he was very cautious, and he had done it before, so I had an experienced person guiding me through this whole process.
And during this, so was this before you lost your grandma?
Oh no, this was way after I lost my grandma. This was in my 6th year recovery, which was, last year, and we're in 2022 right now, and I'm 7.5 years. So, it was about a year and a bit ago now. I lost my grandma in 2009.
Okay, so were you using when you lost your grandma?
That was the year. The year I lost my grandma was the year I started smoking crack. Yeah.
Okay, because like you bring up a good point about, like when you start peeling back the layers and things are coming out and you're realizing like, wow, I lost this or this changed and I lost that as a result. And, grief and loss, like the thing is that it starts with change. A change will promote loss, whether it's good or bad. That change, you end up with a loss of some type. And if we're not being mindful and if we're not connected to ourselves and our spirit, these changes happen and we don't stop and actually process. And then we end up with a bunch of change we never ever grieved, and it can hit us all at once if we're that lucky. But a lot of times people just stay busy, they stay distracted, they stay in self, and they never ever get to that place where they're actually processing the grief that they carry with more than just people. And then as a result of that, this compounding grief that they're carrying, they lose someone, and then that's even harder to get through because they've never ever processed any of it in the first place.
100%. And honestly, the catalyst to this, the triggering for the grief that I ended up opening up to, was actually the catalyst was an ended relationship. that I'd been in for 4 years that I finally had to try to cut off. And that was actually the catalyst to open everything up.
So what have you, so since then, like going through the grief process around the things that you talked about that weren't people, what are some takeaways from that you use to help others going through the same type of thing?
Well, some of the takeaways are, so I have almost 8 years recovery, 7.5 years going on 8. And I'm like, I always look back and I look at what happened through my earlier years right up until, last month. I always connect the dots backwards. And I know that, and because I've sponsored so many people, I have the data that I collect through sponsorship, which is tremendously effective and great data to use moving forward to help others. And I see that most people distract themselves early in their recovery. They get sober, they remove the substance, they stay busy, they do the things that you need to do, and this is part of the process, in the first year or two. And then they get to that third year and they don't know how to transition from like the doing part to part of the feeling part. And a lot of the grief that I found doesn't really come up in the third year, even though it's starting to percolate, because now some of those feelings are coming up, but the big open part of the grieving doesn't come till like year 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and I'm not there yet, but through the sponsorship I have that data. So that's part of what I've collected, and how I am able to help people with that today is like, just for example, at the meeting the other day, I mentioned like, you have to fucking watch your feelings and your emotions and what's happening at year 2 into 3. And so many people have been messaging me lately on that because they're going through it, because our fellowship is now producing people with 2 and 3 years, whereas that wasn't always the case. And they're getting into 4 and 5 years, which wasn't always the case. And why I think people are getting time in now is because more people are working the practical application and the directions contained within our literature, and they're actually staying sober. Whereas in the past, they would normally go out when these spots would hit, and they didn't know what to do with it because no one was giving them any, predictions of this is coming.
Yeah, and you're also kind of talking about the theory of God versus, when you come up against the practical application. And I was just talking about this with somebody yesterday, and how they were questioning that, and that's been a theme with people as you've been talking about it. And this person had attended your book study, and the question of, am I running on my own will, or is it God's will, and is God a theory, or is it not? And that seems to be a mind bender at some point in somebody's recovery early on, once they know that it's coming up. And so this has just happened for this person, and we were talking about that, and I just said, it's I remember going through that, and you were talking about it to me in Medicine Hat, and I was all like mind mush about like, is it a theory, is it not, is it, and what I learned and what I said to this person is that it's a theory until it's not. Like you get out of treatment and you get the job and you get the relationship, or you get your kids back or get your license back. All this life is happening, and people can sometimes think, oh, this is God, or they're just really busy with what's going on, and then that kind of wears off, and then something comes where they have to make a hard decision, right? Am I going to live in recovery, or am I going to do what I always did? And that's where God becomes an actual practical application, and I'm going to rely on God versus, what I've been doing, which is just a theory until it's not, right?
Yeah. And part of the God not being a theory is following the practical application of what is in our step work, and doing the things that the step work actually says, i.e. your step 10. And talking to pillars and not running your own life. The thing about God turning from a theory into not a theory is, as you work a solid program in that first 2 years, you start understanding self. And once you can combat self with the processes, especially step 10, maybe you can't always see God's will, but you can definitely see your will. Am I selfish, resentful, dishonest, or afraid? There's my will. And I follow the process, and I relinquish that. The problem is that I might not get what I want, because God is everything. He's the seemingly good and the seemingly bad. And we usually want what we want. So we always think that God's will is what we want. Sometimes God's will is what we don't want. And we have a hard time accepting that. But once you can accept that and you start working the practical application, which doesn't happen till year 2 or 3 really anyway. And why that's so important is because as you stay sober longer, you need more fucking God. Because that first year is usually mostly theoretical God, and it's the momentum. It's like a wave of fellowship, a wave of positive momentum that takes you into that second and third year where life gets fucking real. And the old habits of running your life again come back. So you got to be hyper aware of self and then follow the processes so you can navigate your way through that shit.
So when you're saying to work a solid program, you're meaning to actually, when it comes up against doing what you want versus doing the right thing or following God's will or not acting in self, you know, turning down the relationship or, you know, not taking a job that sells your soul out. Making those hard decisions is what you're talking about, right? Instead of doing what you always did, you're doing something different, as this book describes. And in that transition, it becomes a theory to a practical application, and you're really actually relying on God.
Right. And a lot of times by not taking that job, not going into that relationship, there's a lot of pain in that, right? And that is the inner turmoil before serenity. That is your step 6 in live action. But as you go through that pain, and there's a knowing in you that knows what you're doing is right, you actually get driven more to God. So the foundation of your life is kind of shaking because you're fucking scared, because the security of what you had maybe in this job for that money of this company you don't want to work for because you sell pieces of your soul, you know that if you don't take that, you might not have the money. And that's really scary. So you go harder to God. And then when you're really reliant on God, God has a way of fucking giving you what you need. But sometimes the test comes down to the fucking wire, right? And through the process of doing what's hard, which is maybe not taking the job, not getting in the relationship, not fucking lashing out and doing what you've always done, what happens underneath the surface is you're building character and you're building trust in God, and you're kind of stepping into that unknown. And that's really where the gift and the growth really come. The illusion of security, it's an illusion. The only real security I think we have as human beings is our ability to contend with the challenge that's put in front of us and to navigate it in a proper way so we can actually build true self-confidence from a place of fucking truth and then take that next baby step.
So I think that, like, I was just kind of going through memory lane here about the importance of having somebody who's been there, done that. And that whole idea of frothy emotional appeal and how that doesn't work for our defects either, or the change that we're trying to make, or having somebody who's never gone through it go into the unknown and telling you like, hey, go into the unknown, and they don't have any experience in that. And that's how we became friends, is, you know, when we first had conversations and, you know, we were talking about the field I work in or having conversations around that. And then a couple weeks later, here I was, remember I was going to interview for that job, and then you called me and you're like, what? It was like 5 minutes before the interview, and then you're like, what are you doing? And I tell you, oh, I'm interviewing for this job. And then you're like, so you're going to interview for a job that you don't want, that you wouldn't take, that would make, why would you do that, kind of thing. And I said, oh, that's a good point. And then I cried and I got off the phone, and you said, I'm just going to let you go, do what you got to do, pray, talk to your higher power. And it was 5 minutes before the interview. And I remember I was just crying, and I was like, and it was so terrifying to let go of what I thought that I knew. And I wasn't even in the moment. I was taking a leap of faith that someone else had done it, and that if I was going to do this, that I was going to see a different result. And so I wasn't letting go because of my faith. I was letting go because you had done that, and you were loving the life that you live. And that gave me hope that if I went into the unknown for myself, that I was going to be okay, and I was going to be better than okay, and that I could have that too. And so for me, that's been how my recovery's been, is to be listening to the people who have been through what I'm going through or where I want to go. And it's using their experiences that allow me to go into the unknown. Because if I was just left to myself to try to navigate the forest of recovery, say, or, stepping into the unknown in more general ways, I wouldn't be able to do that with any assurance that it was going to be okay. And therefore I would sit in this old belief, and that's where I would stay. And that's where a lot of people stay.
And you would stay there out of self-centered fear, out of the illusion of security, and sell little pieces of your soul for something you knew that's eating your soul. So you went into that interview, and from what I recall, they were expecting you to interview and take the position. And what did you say in that interview?
I said, I have given it some second thought, and I don't want to waste your time with the interview. I think we should just call it here. And I felt, embarrassed for sure that I'd canceled the interview last minute. But after I got off the phone, I just felt like peaceful. And then this ripping of like, oh my God. And it was like my ego was coming back, just saying like, what did you do? Like you've just blacklisted yourself from that company. People are going to talk about you. And I went back to just like, no, this is what I need to do, is to step into the unknown. Because the way that I was living my life before, addiction or not, I wasn't happy. And I had come to a place, addiction or not, that I had realized that the material stuff and the job and the status and all these things is not how I wanted to live my life anymore. And that life is really short, and time's ticking, and I wanted to make the changes, and I never knew how to make the changes until I got into this program, till I met you, till I started doing this stuff. And honestly, like I've learned so much in just working with others as well. Like when you talk about collecting data, and that being like probably the most powerful thing in the sense of, understanding addiction or understanding the design for living. I like that better because it applies to everybody. Like all this is applicable to the general population, and you can see it. Like you can really apply the after step one, like all the rest of the stuff you can apply to the way that everybody lives their lives, full of fear and thinking that these solutions they grab outside of themselves are going to be the thing that makes them happy. And the book talks about how you grab for it and you grab for it, and I don't know where in the book, tell me what I'm talking about, but you grab for it, and then you're grabbing more frantically as you go, because you're realizing that your efforts are not working. And I read this, and I was thinking about how I would grab for the job, I would grab for the education, I would grab for the things that society says, and I got more frantic as I was grabbing, because nothing was working. And so then I'm really clawing at whatever it is and getting more frantic. And it's in step 3 or 4 where...
Yeah, is he not a victim of the delusion that he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if he only manages well? And redoubling our efforts.
Yes, that's the one.
Right?
Redoubling the efforts and going back more and more frantically. And that's exactly how it was, is I was running out of options. It wasn't the job, it wasn't the education. And the more that I grabbed at and wasn't fulfilled, the more frantic I got inside of myself, because I was running out of options. And, the book talks about when faced with these options, the life of a spiritual, toolkit, or am I going to keep going on? And I didn't come to that until there was no more options. And I was frantic for an answer. And that's when I became like open-minded to really want to do this, and then finding people in my path. And I think that happened because I really wanted to do it. So I was praying for like somebody and something and the people and the places, and and I really believed that God doesn't make it hard. Like the book says that it doesn't make it hard for people who are really searching. So I just kept praying for God to put in front of me the people and places and things I needed. And it's been that way ever since. And even when I don't know what's going on, I do have enough experience now that God has put the people, places, and things in front of me that allow me to do the next thing. And I have enough experiences of that my faith is now my own, and I don't have to use other people's experiences and faith anymore.
Roger. And I want to tie something else back out of your experience as you know, there was another pretty critical point in your recovery, your life, because recovery is life. When we get to this point, it's not separate from our life. Recovery becomes life. Just for anyone out there that needs that clarification, they're not separate. Recovery's number one, and life falls into alignment. So as you were trying to make the transition out of Medicine Hat to Calgary, you also suffered a lot of turmoil, and there was a lot of fear there, and you weren't really sure, and you got to this point where you finally made a decision, and then you were second guessing your decision, right? You listen to your spirit, you listen to your pillars, and you know what, there's a knowing in you, and then, but the mind always gets involved, and it wants to double think, and fucking there's so much fear, and you got an ex there, and you know, you got a child involved, and so there's all these things that kind of pull you, and then finally you made a decision, and you took action that was almost irreversible.
Right. Yeah, that's a good example to bring up. Thanks. I felt that I needed to be in Calgary, and I felt like that was just something in me that I didn't really know how to explain. And I just had a sense I needed to be in Calgary, I guess. And so I was following that because it was such a sure thing, and I felt like it was sure. But I was hitting so many roadblocks. Like it was like I was looking for a place, and that went through, it didn't go through. And then I was, you know, there was that renting a room there. There was an apartment that I looked at, and there was a roommate situation. There was just these different options. There was a few houses that I wanted to go look at, but I couldn't get there because of, you know, the weather, or my son was sick. There was just lots of obstacles, and I was starting to lose the confidence that what I felt in myself was what I should be doing. And then my mind started going, and it was like, that was when I started with the, Bill, is it my will or is it God's will? Maybe this is not even my will or God's will, and I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Like if it was God's will, then why am I hitting so many roadblocks? And you just kept saying, like, you got to just keep having the faith and put one foot in front of the other. But while that was happening, I think I didn't have enough recovery and my own experiences to really have a confidence around this is going to be okay. And I started to become full of fear and doubt. And I started to question if it was God's will or my will. And I went into the 12 by 12 there, and I was thinking like, oh, maybe I'm convincing myself of all these things, you know, how it talks about we can't be inspired all the time, and we can convince ourselves of some pretty stupid shit if we think that, like, maybe this is stupid shit. And so I was starting to get really discouraged. And one of the mistakes that I made, I think, is that I went under the whole mental health angle of I can't help anybody because I can't, like, I'm so not okay, and I can't give from a broken cup or an empty cup or whatever I was thinking. And I really felt like I didn't have anything to offer because I was feeling so shitty. And it wasn't until like months later, like, that I had been in Calgary and I was going through the book with somebody, and I was like, holy shit. And then there's Bill, who, you know, he's just all over the depression and the self-pity and whatever. And what's he doing? He's frantically looking for somebody to help. And so I think that this is another example of how God put people in my world, you know, the same as what I was praying, like, give me the people and the places and the things I need to do what I need to do. And during that time, I was getting a lot of calls from a treatment center to do these Zoom step 5s, and that kept me going. And I had a couple of sponsees that were calling, and they weren't very far behind me from the treatment center. And I was like, there was a lot of pressure to like have it figured out. I was putting on myself, and what I see that actually did was I dug into the literature because I had to give something, right? So that this whole idea, like, that, you know, we help others for, you know, the responsibility and the duty and the insurance and the pleasure of it. Like, I can see how there's the insurance, and because every time I was helping others because I needed to, because they were calling and I was not too far in front of them, so I needed the answers. So I was digging into the book, and I was digging into, you know, the podcasts, and I was attending your book study, and I was just really trying to stay on top of the people that were wanting help, because I don't like turning that down, but I would not seek it out. And so that whole time frame was really dark, those couple of months where it was just winter, and I was, you know, pretty much by myself in my mind with just like a couple of people from Calgary in recovery that I was connected to. And I look back at that now, and it was actually a really beautiful time in my life because of what was going on. And when things finally like worked out, I got to Calgary, and it took a little bit. Like, there was a couple of things that happened, that were unexpected, but I never doubted the decision because I felt it, and once I got here, and now I'm able to look back at that time and be like, okay, I see where I could have, frantically looked for people to help. And I also see how God was doing for me what I couldn't do for myself, and that people were contacting me and keeping me connected to the program. And my program, I think, like, there's the time frames of things, but I also think that my recovery has been a little bit unique in that there was a couple of big movements that I had to make early on that really was a big, like, I'm leaping out of the fucking plane with the parachute and this better work. And that was early on, like, before the first year was even up. I was moving cities, and I was leaving my job, and I was doing these things that I think ultimately sped up a couple of the growing pains. They happened all at once early on. And I think that, having to rely on God in such an extreme way early on was beneficial. I'm glad that I was well supported. And I think that, like, if people are out there struggling, trying to do this themselves, the best thing that they can do is to stay connected with the people who are talking out of the book and who can guide them in the right ways when they're in their heads. Like, this could not have been done by myself. And so many times, like, it was uncanny, the conversations and the times you would call.
And like, what I want to point out is we don't do this alone, right? We don't do this alone. We rely on pillars. We rely on God. We build that relationship with God. Pillars are great, and you can get answers, from pillars that are aligned with God if the pillars are God-centered and they have your well-being at the forefront. And a lot of times we have to care more about your life than your feelings because we get it, right? We're more experienced. And part of what I said earlier was when you have the challenge and you navigate it properly with the decision, with the practical application of what we're doing, I can always see my will. And when you were struggling with all of your struggles, it's pretty fucking apparent to me that you were stuck in selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, mostly fear. And you had the fear of your material security, you had the fear of your emotional security tied with your child and with your mom and, your home and where you grew up. And so there's all of these instincts pulling at you at once, which is manifesting the self-centered fear. And to me, that was easy to spot so many times, which is why talking with you was very easy for me to do, because I could pin the self-centeredness in a fucking second. And then once I showed it to you, because you couldn't always see it, and newer in recovery, we can't always see self from self. And it gets more cunning as we get older in our recovery, and it gets a little more harder to see too, which is why we have to continually work this program. So kind of going back to our topic of grieving, since you've been here, you've settled in really nicely. And I think a lot of what's carried you through, and I can guarantee you it's the same for me, is sponsorship. Sponsorship will carry you through the toughest of times, because when we get into the suffering and the pains of our life, we are almost always concerned with us, and we are fucking fully engulfed in self. And the number one thing we can do is get out of self and go help somebody else. In Bill's story in the big book, it lays it out pretty clear. I was overwhelmed with resentment and self-pity, waves of self-pity, but I soon found that working with another alcoholic would always save the day. And it talks about it in the chapter, Working with Others, that it works when all other activities fail. What are the activities that other people are going to use, or most people are going to use, is just your prayer and meditation. Most won't even fucking really reach out. And if they're reaching out and they're new, they're reaching out to people that aren't 12 centered in God's steps. So they're getting feedback based in the ego and old ideas and emotions and behaviors still. So they don't grow through it, and that shit takes them back out, right? So navigating the challenges properly builds that self-esteem and self-confidence. And when you're in the book, like, you're pretty confident in everything you're doing now, right? And you're calm. Like, there's just a calmness about you. And so many people are attracted to your calmness and your ability to navigate the challenges, that's what they want now, right? And so that's really something that's really important to note.
You want to stop there?
Yeah, but we didn't really talk much about the grief. Thank you for tuning in to the UDRcast. We hope you have enjoyed this episode. The viewpoints and the opinions expressed today were solely of the individual sharing them. If you resonated with this episode, please follow us and share this link with anyone that may benefit from it. Please visit us at BILLWARDLIFE to see everything that we have going on. We can recover, one person, one family, one community at a time. Thank you for tuning in to the UDRcast. We hope you have enjoyed this episode. The viewpoints and the opinions expressed today were solely of the individual sharing them. If you resonated with this episode, please follow us and share this link with anyone that may benefit from it. Please visit us at BILLWARD.life to see everything that we have going on. We can recover, one person, one family, one community at a time.